How's it going, everybody? This is Noah once again, and I wanted to bring you the second round of updates from some of the stuff that I got up to while I was on the West Coast. The first thing is I was fortunate enough to tune into the FDA's Rare Disease Day virtual meeting house where they talked about a lot of the different things that are coming through the FDA, some of the programs that they're looking to explore this year, as well as some of the changes that we might expect. Now, the other thing they did was a great job telling a bunch of patient stories. And so if that's something that interests you and you want to hear about the wider rare disease community, I would encourage you to head over to their website or their YouTube channel and check out the live recording of that meeting. As for the things that stood out to me and the stuff that I think BDSRA is going to try to focus on a little bit in the coming year, they talked about this program Pragmatica, which is out of their oncology centers of excellence, and it's for rare cancers. And as per the name, it's a means of some expedited guidelines for treatments for these rare disorders. Now, well, it's specific to those rare cancers, and so not something that we could immediately apply to the approval process for rare diseases. It does represent a really efficient template for making some of those decisions on the timeline that is necessitated by disorders like Batten disease. And so I think it's a really good thing for us to look into and use as a baseline for some of what we might be able to accomplish. Another thing that they talked a lot about was expanding the remote support for clinical trials. Now, we all know that one of the challenges of clinical trials is you have to be on the trial site, receiving those infusions or receiving that care in person. And that tends to be a pretty big strain on families. It's a lot of travel. It's a lot of time out of your day. It's a lot of pressure on everybody. And so bringing a little bit of the technology that we've developed through the pandemic and since to the clinical trial process to do things on site at a local hospital with remote support from the primary researchers, to do some of that feedback and follow-up also remotely through some of these video conference services is something that the FDA is exploring more. And I think that that's going to be a real boon to our families as we look forward to new clinical trials and new treatments. This is just something that's going to make it all the more accessible and all the less of a strain on family resources and time. And the last thing that they talked about that I think is of great interest to the Batten community is increasing patient input on trial design. Now, clinical trials are typically designed by researchers as per the FDA guidelines, and occasionally they can miss some of the compassion and the real practical understanding that is needed to make them accessible and really effective for families. There's a ton of secondary communication that needs to go on between patients, providers, and researchers that patients don't always have the language for, that caregivers don't always have the language for. And so giving them an opportunity to come to the table in the early parts of trial design is something that I think is going to bring a lot more of that understanding and that compassion into how clinical trials are structured and run, and ultimately make them better for our families. So the other thing that I got up to on Friday of last week was I got to have a meeting with some folks at BioMarin and talk a little bit more about the evolving role of advocacy in rare disease and some of the challenges there. Now, I bring the perspective of a sibling, and one of the hardest things about talking about siblings in rare disease is it's really difficult to come up with things that will affect the siblings directly. And so getting a chance to talk with some of the advocates and think about what some real practical things we can do for siblings are was a really great conversation. We talked a lot about giving siblings some of the language that they need to talk about what's going on with their brother or sister. The explanation that you get is really different when you're 8 years old versus when you're 10 versus when you're 14. And I know from my own experience that it took me almost that long to pronounce my brother's disorder. I mean, mucopolysaccharidosis is way too many syllables to count. And so bringing in industry partners and providers to help give us some of those metaphors and those comparisons that we rely on to make our peers and our friends understand what we're going through is something that is really, really comforting as a sibling. And so getting to talk about that as a concrete thing that we can do for our siblings and that we can partner with with our peers in industry to do is something that's really exciting to me, and I was grateful to have the opportunity to talk about it. So that was my trip on the West Coast. I wish it was a little sunnier, but I'm glad that I got to have the conversations that I did, and really grateful for the opportunity. So thank you again to our partners and the folks that invited me out there. And last but not least, my name is Noah Siedman. I'm a rare sibling, and I'm a Batten advocate for here.